This is Professor Derf Seitz. This Java tutorial demonstrates if-else selection flow control statements. We have a class if-else. We have some data members here that will be used in the conditions of the if statements, the if conditions and the else conditions. And we have a Boolean that will initially be set to true that will be used in a validation example. We're going to test with different values of these data fields on each run. In our main function, we call functions that will illustrate each of the various things we want to show here. Starting with just an if, run if, we have a simple if statement. The code annotates itself, as we'll see in the output. An if statement has a condition and a block of code with braces that begin the block and end the block. If the condition is true, the block of code will run. The block of code can be multiple statements. To keep things simple, we have a simple annotation here, and that's it, one line. After the if statement runs, regardless if this condition is true or false, the next statement after the block will run. We should print out next statement when we get to that point in the code. It's important to have proper indentation on an if statement. The braces here, it's recommended that you line it up with the if, and the block of code is indented to show this level is one level under the if. An if-else has an if statement and then an else, which is optional for the if. If the condition on the if is true, you run the if block but not the else block. If the condition is false, you run the else block but not the if block. In either case, when you finish running whichever block it is, the next statement after the entire if-else will be executed. A nested if shows that you can put ifs and if-elses inside other ifs. Here we have an if-else, and then in the first if block, another if-else. It's important to note the indentation here. Indentation within the first if indents in, and then the nested if indents further in. If you don't maintain proper indentation, it will become virtually impossible to understand the logic and to maintain it. Again, on this one, in either case, when you're all done with this entire statement, the next statement in the flow will be executed. Here is a bad semicolon. Do not put a semicolon after your condition. You're maybe used to putting semicolons at the end of statements, but this is not the statement, this is the condition. You will not get a syntax error when you do this, unfortunately, to warn you, because officially it is allowed to have an if with just a condition that runs the condition and doesn't do anything. And so this would just be a statement, and the block, you can have braces that start and end a block without an if, is treated as the next statement. So if the if is true, it will run the condition and the block, of course, because it's next. But if the if is false, you would think it would skip the block, but it won't, because that is the next statement. Do not put semicolons after your condition on an if. If you do, you may have a bug that will be very hard for you to find, because when you look at the code, you can easily overlook this little punctuation mark. Missing braces, another bad practice. If you leave off the braces on an if, the rule is that the if block will be a single statement. If a programmer indents two statements thinking that they're under this if, they will be deceived about what their logic really is, because only the first statement is part of the if. The second statement is not. If the condition is false, the second statement will run because it's the next statement. Always use braces, even on a single statement if statement, to make it clear what the scope of the if block is. And the same goes for the else blocks. Here we have some recommendations involving validation. Here we have handle errors last is discouraged. This example, we call a function to see if something's valid. If it is valid, then we have our normal code when we're dealing with a valid input. And the normal code is usually bigger than the error handling code, and now that code has to be indented under this if statement, making for a more complex structure. And down here under the else is where it would handle the code when it's not valid, the error code. Handling the error code last makes your normal code much more complex because it's indented an additional level. The recommendation is to do it this way. Check is valid. If it's false, that means you have an error. Handle the error. Here we print out something, return out of the function, and then at that point we know that it's valid and our normal code is not more complicated by being indented at a level. Here's the simple function. Is valid just returns the value of our data member, be valid. We're going to run this code now and look at the output. Here's the output. On our if statement, it took the if branch and then the next statement. On the if else, it took the if branch and then the next statement. On the nested if, it hit an else branch and then the next statement. On the bad semicolon, it did the if branch and the next statement. On the missing braces, it did the if branch part 1 and the if branch part 2 and the next statement. Validate last and validate first produce the same results, but the code is simpler on the validate first. We're going to go in now and change our test variable values. We changed our condition control variables. I is now set to 1, J to 10, and the be valid to false this time, so it will not be valid when we validate. And everything else is the same in the program. Let's run it again and look at the output. This time on our if, it just went to the next statement, bypassed the if. On the if else, did the else branch in the next statement. On the nested if, we hit an if and then a nested else inside there in the next statement. In the bad semicolon, the if branch and then the next statement. On the missing brace, if branch part 2 and the next statement. In the validate last and the validate first, we got the error message invalid something, try again. Again, no difference in the actual output, just the simplicity of the code. We'll go back to the code again. So to summarize the main points, on any if-else statements, be sure to use proper braces and indentation to make your logic very clear. You have your conditions. In a previous tutorial, we looked at all the different kinds of conditions that could be used, which included equality, not equality, relational, logical operators. You can have an optional else. You can nest the ifs and the elses and other statements. The blocks here can be any code you want. You can make things quite complex, and I would recommend not being too complex. You should also keep in mind to use function calls. Rather than having a lot of code that's very difficult to read, you can break blocks of code into functions and call things, and that's a great way to simplify your program. Watch out for the bad semicolon error. Look for that, because that'll really be difficult if you're kind of, just don't see it. The missing brace, always put the brace in, even if it's a single statement. Put a brace before it, a brace after it, closing brace, and the single statement to avoid being deceived and thinking that this is really a block when it's not. And then handling errors. Again, if you do your error handling first and get out with the return statement. The return takes you out of the function that you're in. Another good reason to use functions, also called methods, because you can do things like that to simplify your code, and then have the main body of your code after. So these are some tips and best practices on the if-else selection flow control statements.